There's a phone call that supposedly happened in the days after December 18th, 1978, that never made it into any movie. And if the account is true, it might be the single coldest moment in this entire story. A woman in Brownsville, Brooklyn, picks up her phone. Her son is dead, shot 5 times in an Ozone Park apartment, and the man on the other end of the line is offering his condolences, telling her how sorry he is, asking if there's anything he can do. That man is Tommy DeSimone, the same man who pulled the trigger. I want to be straight with you before we go any further, because this detail is the kind of thing that circulates through mob folklore for decades without ever showing up in a court transcript, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Nobody under oath confirmed that phone call. It comes from accounts that have passed through people close to that crew, the kind of story that gets repeated at enough distance from the truth that you can't fully verify it, and you can't fully dismiss it either. So take it as what it is. A piece of the legend around these two men, not a proven fact. But legend or not, it points at something the movie genuinely erased, and once you see it, you can't unsee it in that scene. Goodfellas gives you Stacks Edwards as a punchline. A guy who forgot to crush a van, got a little high, got a little lazy, and paid for it with his life in about 90 seconds of screen time. Tommy shoots him. The camera barely lingers, and the movie moves on to the next disappearance in the Lufthansa body, count like Stacks was never anybody to begin with. What the movie doesn't tell you is that Tommy DeSimone and Parnell Stacks Edwards knew each other long before that December morning, that they came up together, ran together, trusted each other in a world where trust gets you killed as often as it protects you, and that when Jimmy Burke needed Stacks eliminated, he didn't send a stranger. He sent the one man Stacks would open the door for without hesitation, because that man was supposed to be his friend. This is the real relationship between Tommy DeSimone and Stacks Edwards. How two very different young men from very different corners of New York ended up close inside Burke's crew. Why Burke chose Tommy specifically for a job that friendship should have made impossible. And what it says about this entire world that the closest thing to loyalty it ever produced could still end in 5 gunshots, and if the story is true, a phone call afterward that no decent person would ever be capable of making. 2 kids who shouldn't have crossed paths. Start with how unlikely this friendship actually was, because that's what makes it worth telling. Tommy DeSimone came from a family with real standing in organized crime, an uncle who ran a criminal organization on the West Coast, brothers already connected, a bloodline that told him from childhood he was owed a place at the table. He grew up believing the life was his inheritance, not something he'd have to claw his way into from nothing. Stacks Edwards had none of that. Parnell Stephen Edwards was born in 1952 in Brownsville, a Brooklyn neighborhood that produced survivors, not princes. He was black, working in a criminal underworld built almost entirely around Italian family structure, which meant he could never be made, never inherit anything, never sit at a table that belonged to somebody else's bloodline no matter how good he was at the job. Everything Stacks had, he built himself. Connections he earned through usefulness. Protection he rented through reliability. A reputation as a guy who could drive, who could handle himself, who kept his mouth shut and did the work without complaint. On paper, these are 2 men who exist on opposite ends of the same criminal world. One inherited access. The other had to manufacture it, piece by piece, favor by favor, with no safety net if he ever slipped, and yet accounts from people who moved through Robert's Lounge and the outer edges of Jimmy Burke's operation in the 1970s described Tommy and Stacks as genuinely close. Not just crew members who tolerated each other, but 2 young men who actually liked spending time together, who drank together, who trusted each other with information that could get either of them killed if it reached the wrong ears. Some of that closeness likely came from proximity. Burke's crew wasn't enormous, and the men inside had spent an enormous amount of time in each other's company, planning scores, waiting out surveillance, killing hours in the kind of low-grade boredom that criminal work actually consists of more often than movies suggest. But proximity alone doesn't explain genuine affection, and multiple accounts describe exactly that between these 2 men. Tommy, for all his documented brutality towards strangers and rivals, apparently showed a different side around Stacks. Looser, warmer, the kind of familiarity you don't fake convincingly over years. What Stacks actually offered the crew, It's worth understanding exactly what made Stacks valuable, because it explains why a man with real limitations, a heroin habit that was worsening to the late 1970s, no protection through bloodline, and outsider status in an Italian crew, still managed to stay useful enough to keep working with Burke for years. Stacks had spent time in the mid-1970s moving in Muhammad Ali's entourage, working as informal security, which meant he'd already learned something most young men in Burke's orbit never had to learn: how to stay calm around genuine danger and genuine fame at the same time, how to be present, useful, and invisible all at once. That's a rare combination, and it translated directly into what Burke's crew needed from him: driving, running errands nobody wanted their face associated with, handling logistics quietly and competently. He also played blues guitar in small Brooklyn and Queens clubs, a detail that tells you something about who Stacks actually was underneath the criminal work. A man with an actual creative life, an identity that existed outside the crew, something Tommy DeSimone, whose entire sense of self seems to have been built around his place inside that world, arguably never had. If anything, that difference might be part of what drew them together, opposites who filled something in each other. Tommy got a friend, without the constant pressure of outfit politics and family obligation sitting on top of the relationship. Stacks got proximity to a man whose reputation kept people from testing him, protection by association, the same currency every outsider in that world had to rent instead of inherit, the job that should have stayed simple. By December 1978, Burke's crew had just pulled off the Lufthansa heist at JFK, the largest cash robbery in American history at that point, and Stacks had one specific unglamorous job: take the getaway van to a mob-connected junkyard in New Jersey and have it crushed, erasing every trace of physical evidence before investigators could connect it to anyone. We've covered the mechanics of what happened next in detail in an earlier video, so I'm not going to walk through the entire timeline again here. The short version, for anyone catching this one first: Stacks didn't make it to New Jersey. He drove to his girlfriend's place in Brooklyn instead, parked the van on a residential street, went upstairs, and by most accounts got high and lost track of time while the biggest crime scene in the country sat outside on the curb, collecting attention. It was never supposed to survive long enough to collect. Police towed it days later. Fingerprints connected it directly back to him, and once the FBI could physically put a name on a piece of Lufthansa evidence, Stacks stopped being a crew member in Jimmy Burke's mind and started being a liability that could talk under pressure. What matters for this video isn't the mistake itself. It's what happened after Burke decided Stacks had to go, because that decision put Tommy DeSimone in an impossible position, and the movie has zero interest in showing you that a real person had to live through it. Why Burke chose Tommy specifically. Think about the actual logistics of what Burke needed. Stacks knew he was in danger. Accounts describe him going into hiding almost immediately after the van was recovered, bouncing between places, avoiding Robert's lounge, avoiding the familiar faces and familiar knocks that used to mean safety and now meant something closer to a death sentence, walking up the stairs. A man that spooked doesn't open the door for just anybody. He doesn't answer for a stranger. He might not even answer for most of the crew, because by that point Stacks understood exactly what a knock at his door could mean. What he would open the door for without a second thought, without hesitation, without even reaching for a weapon first, was his friend, the one guy in that entire crew he genuinely trusted, not just professionally, but personally. That's not a coincidence in who Burke sent. That's the entire strategic logic of the choice. Angelo Sepe went with Tommy on the hunt for Stacks, by most accounts a quieter, more methodical presence. But it was Tommy who mattered for the actual moment of contact, because Tommy was the only person in Burke's orbit who could walk up to that door and be let in without a fight, without a chase, without the kind of struggle that draws neighbors and police reports. Burke wasn't just choosing his most reliable killer. He was choosing the one relationship Stacks hadn't yet learned to fear. Sit with what that actually required from Tommy DeSimone, a man capable, by every account of his life, of extraordinary and casual violence towards strangers, rivals, made men, virtually anyone who crossed him. This job wasn't that. This job required him to use an actual friendship. Whatever warmth genuinely existed between these two men over years of proximity and shared danger as a delivery mechanism for an execution. Not overpower a friend. Not surprise a friend. Be trusted by a friend specifically, so the friend wouldn't see it coming. There's a version of Tommy DeSimone in the historical record capable of almost anything. A man Henry Hill and others described as someone who would kill over an insult, over a mood, over nothing at all. But even inside that record, using a real friendship as a weapon against a friend himself sits in a different category. It's not rage. It's not a business calculation made from a comfortable distance, the way Jimmy Burke experienced this decision. It's intimate, premeditated betrayal, carried out by the one person positioned to make it work precisely because it would never have worked coming from anyone else. December 18th, from the other side of the door, we've told a mechanical version of this morning before. 6:17 a.m. Ozone Park, 5 shots, no argument, no pleading, over before the city fully wakes up. This time, sit inside it from the other direction, because that's the part the earlier telling didn't have room for. By most accounts, Stacks had been running for days by the time he ended up in that Ozone Park apartment, exhausted in the specific way fear and withdrawal compound each other, still telling himself there was a conversation left to have, still hoping enough time might soften Burke's position. And then a knock comes, and it's not a stranger's knock, and it's not the kind of knock that makes an exhausted, frightened man reach for anything or run for a window. It's Tommy. It's fine. It's just Tommy. That single detail is the entire tragedy the movie skips past in about 90 seconds. Stacks Edwards didn't die afraid of the man who killed him. He died at ease around him, comfortable enough not to protect himself in the one moment protecting himself might have mattered most. Whatever Tommy DeSimone felt walking through that door, and there's no way for us to know that with any certainty. What we do know is that the friendship itself is what made the killing possible with the speed and silence Burke's crew needed. No standoff. No struggle loud enough for neighbors to intervene before it was over. Just a door opening for someone Stacks trusted and 5 shots. The phone call, taken for exactly what it is. Now here's where we come back to that detail from the top of this video, because it deserves more than a passing mention, and it also deserves the honesty of being labeled clearly for what it is. The story, as it circulated through accounts connected to that era and that crew, holds that in the days following the murder, Tommy DeSimone called Stacks Edwards' mother to offer his condolences, expressed sympathy for her loss, behaved on the phone like a grieving friend rather than the man who pulled the trigger 5 times. I want to be completely honest about the evidentiary weight of that claim, because a channel built on separating the real story from a movie version has to hold itself to that standard even when a detail is this good for the story. There's no court record of this call, no sworn testimony describing it. It sits in the same category as a lot of mob folklore from this era, stories that circulate through people who knew people, repeated at gatherings and in later interviews, impossible to fully confirm and, honestly, impossible to fully dismiss either, because so much of what we do know about Tommy DeSimone's psychology makes it entirely plausible, if it happened. And I want to stress that if it tells you something almost unbearable about what these relationships actually were inside that world, not that the friendship was fake all along, a performance Tommy maintained purely for operational convenience. Something colder and more complicated than that. That Tommy DeSimone may genuinely have cared about Stacks, in whatever damage, compartmentalized way a man like that was capable of caring about anyone, and was still able to kill him on Burke's order, and then perform grief convincingly enough to a grieving mother days later. 2 things existing in the same man, without apparently canceling each other out. Real affection and total, functional ruthlessness running side by side, with almost no friction between them. That's a harder idea to sit within a simple villain who never cared about anybody. It suggests the coldest thing about this entire world isn't that it produces men incapable of loyalty. It's that it produces men capable of real loyalty who kill the people they're loyal to anyway, the moment the organization requires it, and then find a way to keep living with themselves afterward. Whether that specific phone call is literally true or not, it captures something true about the mechanism. In that world, love and violence were never actually opposites. They ran on the same track, and the track always belonged to the organization first. What the movie couldn't use. It's worth asking directly why Goodfellas strips this relationship down to nothing, because a friendship this complicated would actually be incredible filmmaking material if the movie had room for it. The honest answer is structural. Goodfellas is Henry Hill's story. told through Henry's eyes, and Henry wasn't standing in that doorway in Ozone Park. He didn't witness whatever history existed between Tommy and Stacks over preceding years, and the movie, built entirely around Henry's first-hand experience of that world, has no natural way to dramatize a friendship it never had access to from Henry's vantage point. Stacks exists in the film almost entirely as a plot mechanism, the mistake that threatens the crew, the loose end that gets tied off. Giving him a real inner life, a real relationship with his killer, would have required a different movie entirely, one willing to slow down and sit with exactly the kind of moral complexity this video has spent the last several minutes unpacking. But that compression costs the story its most human, most disturbing detail. The movie wants you to understand Tommy DeSimone as dangerous because he's unpredictable, because you never know what will set him off. The real relationship with Stacks Edwards suggests something scarier than unpredictability. A man perfectly capable of genuine warmth, genuine friendship, genuine affection for another human being, who could still walk through that person's door on someone else's order and end their life in seconds, because in the hierarchy Tommy DeSimone actually lived inside, loyalty to the organization always outranked loyalty to any individual person, even one he apparently loved. Two men, two very different kinds are expendable. There's a final piece of this worth naming plainly, because it connects Stacks' death to the larger machine both men were living inside. Stacks Edwards was expendable to Jimmy Burke the moment his fingerprints turned up on that van, and he was expendable in a specific way that had everything to do with who he was and who he wasn't. Not Italian, not protected by bloodline, not made and never eligible to be made, no matter how reliable or useful he proved himself over years of work. When Burke needed to remove risk from the Lufthansa aftermath, Stacks was always going to be among the first names on that list, because men without inherited protection are always the first to be treated as disposable when an organization starts protecting itself. Tommy DeSimone, despite everything that made him valuable to Burke for a decade, met the same fate roughly 6 weeks later, executed by the Gambino family, with at least a tacit permission of his own side, for reasons that have been accumulating since 1970. Different circumstances, different people pulling the trigger, but the same underlying machine. In this world, usefulness rents you time. It never buys you safety. Stacks found that out in an Ozone Park apartment at 6:17 in the morning. Tommy found it out in a house in Queens a little over a month later, walking and expecting the ceremony that would finally make everything he believed about his own bloodline official. Two men, on opposite ends of the same organization's hierarchy, connected by a friendship that ended in an execution, both of them eventually discovering that nothing they'd given that world, not loyalty, not reliability, not years of work, not even real affection between two specific men who genuinely liked each other, was worth more than the risk they eventually represented. If this gave you a version of Stacks Edwards the movie never let you see, subscribe, because we're not finished with this crew. Next week we're covering Angelo Sepe, the quiet, methodical shooter who went with Tommy that morning, and outlived almost everyone connected to Lufthansa until his own past finally caught up with him too. Drop a comment and tell me which relationship from this world you want unpacked next, because so far, every friendship in this story turns out to have a cost nobody in the movie ever had to pay.